So I hope that everybody can see my screen and can see that it's correct. So before starting, thank you very much to Vincent Robin and all the team for inviting me to give this introduction to this session. It will be really first time for me that I do this exercise to talk in English to my computer for around 25 minutes. So I hope it will be a success. I try to select some nice pictures linked with ecological ecology and restoration ecology. And I tried as though to choose a language that can be clear for everybody in front of the screen of a computer. And perhaps it will not be around, my talk will not be around 45 minutes, perhaps only 30 minutes, which is quite good to follow a video presentation. So perhaps you will still you will understand that my English can be also virtual. I'm not an English native speaker. I try every day. And I will propose a talk about linking historical ecology and biological conservation. And all my presentation will be from not only my own work, but the work of these teams, which were former students and now colleagues like Vincent Robin, for example. And all my talk would be from a case study from the Mediterranean steppe, because it's concrete data, it's concrete jobs. But of course, even if it's a case study from a Mediterranean steppe, I hope that most of the lesson can be applied to other type of ecosystem in the world. So let's go. To start, I would like just to remind the definition I will use of historical ecology. It's the definition, classical definition from Emily Russell for his two books edited before 2000 and in 2019, and say that historical ecology is the field of ecology which aims at reconstructing the history of ecosystem and landscape in order to analyze how it has impacted biodiversity and ecosystem functioning, especially with respect of human activities. Of course, all the historical ecology I have done are linked with former human activities. Of course, my talk will be about the link between historical ecology, ecological restoration, biological conservation. And I think that everybody knows this very famous reference, which has been published in Science in 2009, which is a very good paper which linked the two domains of ecological restoration and ecological history. And the authors say that ecological restoration is rooted in ecological history. Why? Oh, sorry. Because ecological history allows to identify appropriate conservation and restoration targets. It allows us to state of the ecosystem before disruption, before degradation. It allows to assess source of damage. It allows to identify threshold of irreversibility. And as you can see in this graph, it can help restorationists to define the level of conservation or restoration. And in particular, you can see that sometimes what we call the historical system, the system of reference of conservation of restoration, sometimes is so degraded that we accept now in the domain of restoration ecology that we cannot restore this ecosystem because of technical, scientific reason, but also because of socioeconomic reasons. We don't have the money to do that. It will not be accepted by population. And instead of using this term of degraded ecosystem, we use now this type of novel ecosystem. It's a kind of new nature. And of course, restorationists and conservationists, they would like to have from historical ecologists the production of a real applied historical ecology. Like is in this book, most of the restorationists, they would like to have, for example, a guide of reference ecosystem to restore. It will be for conservationists and restorationists the growl of that this type of research can produce. But it is also clear that sometimes we cannot, as you can show in this short sentence, I like this sentence very much, but sometimes it will perhaps be not possible to restore the integrality of an historical ecosystem, of a reference ecosystem, because nature is always produce new forms, and what has been exists comes not again. And so it could be a problem, because if you want to restore an historical ecosystem, sometimes we would have to find against nature. And now there is a question, so in this case, how historical ecology can help. So I also in my mind this consideration, but perhaps it is false now, but when I read a lot of papers, that most of the study of historical ecology are still in forest ecosystem. So I can cite this famous paper. So thank you very much again, Jean-Luc Dutoit, for this very, very nice paper. It's enjoyed me a lot, and this paper is at the origin of my research in ecological history. And also this review of Martin, this famous review, but a lot of, and perhaps most of publication in historical ecology are done in forest ecosystem. For herbaceous ecosystem, there is perhaps always the risk that the current fire regime and the grazing regime have perhaps erased the trace of other former human practice and the old one. But also some famous new paper, not so new now, it has been done in 2007, which show that it's not the case, because in this paper, Bartels and colleagues have shown that the grassland diversity of some calcareous grassland of the island of Alvar can be related to the later on age human and population density. So we can really do very good ecological studies in grassland ecosystem, and even we can perhaps have a signal of very old human practice. So this is my case. So that's meant now 20 years, like I do with my team again, some historical and restoration ecology in a steppe-like ecosystem in southern France, which is called La Crau. It is, I will present you more detail about this area after. And so the major question we've got concerning historical ecology was the ecosystem origins of this area. Is it natural or semi-natural ecosystem? This is really a classical question before doing restoration and conservation. We are, of course, interested a lot, again, at second, in human legacy. Is the human footprint will be indelible, so it will be difficult to restore or to do reviving in this case. And after, now the third question is, of course, what about the interaction, because between the historical heritage and the global change effects. So it is more linked with climate of land use change. And of course, all the data we will have from the answer to this question will help to define the conservation of restoration regime. Do we have to do active or passive restoration, or do we have to revive the ecosystems? It is the link for us between historical ecology and conservation or restoration ecology. So some several words about this ecosystem. So the Lacroplan is in southern France. It is really an area of grassland and no trees, as you can see. And it is, of course, the result of a Mediterranean climate, a particular shallow soil, and of course, the practice of grazing. It is, of course, a unique and specific plant community, like, of course, plenty of other type of ecosystem in the world. The local name is the Cusul, coming from the Latin cursorium, that means the space we cross, because it has been for all time an open area, and it is characterized by very high species richness, more than 40 to 50 plants per square meter, and with some common plants which dominates the area. For example, the Thymus vulgaris, thyme, and Brachypodium retusum, which are very common. And as you can see, it's very beautiful when you look at, when you have look like your foot, you can see that there is plenty of different species, mostly annual species. And of course, in this area, we've got endemic species, very rare, and it's a unique place in the world, for example, for the Rhodanian cricket, from, of course, steppe birds, and also for the ocelot lizard, which shows its biggest population in France in this area. It's a very, very beautiful lizard. And more linked with historical ecology is really a space of grazing. We've got the evidence by documents and by archaeological traces of millennia of transhumanship grazing. And as you can see, we've got a very old literatural data for Pliny in 77 Anno Domini. So I'm very proud always to put some Latin in an English presentation, but of course I can't help you for the translation. And well, you can see that even during the Roman period, in the 1st century before Christ, it is as though this plain is as though described as an area of grazing, and it is already mentioned the presence of the time in this area. So it has been open for around 2,000 years. And of course, it's not because we've got millennia of transhumanship grazing that there is no change in grazing practice, and especially in the beginning of the 21st century, because of the arrival of the wolf in the Alps and not in the Crau area. Until now, we've got no wolf in this area, but the practice used to fight against the wolf in the Alps have been bring back to this area, and we've got now more and more dogs for the defense of the flock, and you have to take really care of these dogs. And you've got more and more use of fencing areas for keeping the sheep instead of using some shepherds. So that's made it an area of millennia of grazing, but with now recensions really in the grazing practice. So really it's a unique biological heritage. So sometimes we fail about giving a good estimation, especially in France, of our biological heritage, but we can make comparison with the cultural heritage. And if we make this comparison about the unicity of this area and the time it has been created, we can compare this biological heritage to this cultural heritage. But really, this step is a kind of monument, a biological monument, as soon as important, like of course the Stone Age. And of course, in Stone Age there is no program of destruction, of cultivation, of intensive cultivation, and so on, which is not the case on the Crau area. So at the origin, it was a big steppe area of around 500 square kilometers, and you can see we try to reconstruct the landscape of this grassland before the 16th century, and now up we have something like that. We have lost more than 80% of the original area, and the total area, which was in one piece before the 16th century, now is more and more fragmented. So we lose some areas because of, as you can see, industrial orchards, some quarries, military areas, and so on. So we lose a lot of the original area, and it is more and more fragmented. So remember our question. The first question was what was the origin of this state? Because of course, if it's a natural ecosystem, a kind of primary ecosystem, of pristine ecosystem, so perhaps we don't need to continue to conserve with the use of sheep grazing. But perhaps the story is different. Perhaps this area is a not completed primary succession, because in some place we can sometimes have some shrubs, some Rosmarinus officinalis or Philera angustifolia shrubs. So it means that perhaps at the origin it was a primary succession that was stopped by human utilization, I mean safari and grazing. And perhaps at the origin it was not only a steppe, but not a forest, but a form of mixed area, a steppe with some trees. Or the classical hypothesis before our works was that the steppe, the origin is degrading mature forest, or oak forest, which had been degraded by fire and grazing. So trying to answer to this question, we do wood charcoal sampling and wood charcoal analyze, because it was not possible to sample pollens in wetlands. We've got no local wetlands in this area. And the exercise to collect macro soil wood charcoal in a very shallow soil, which have been grazing and submitted to erosion for centuries, it's quite difficult. It's difficult to find enough soil in this area. So we've got this original idea, and we find 6 interesting sites. We've got this idea to try to find some area which would be suitable to collect more wood charcoal. And this idea was, in fact, to use the discover in this area of a very original truss, a unique truss of sheepfolds dated from the Roman period, and our colleague Badan and collaborators have found more than 100 sheepfolds in this area, which is incredible and unique in Europe. And you can see the foundation of this sheepfold, and here by the author reconstitution of what it could have been. And we've got as well the possibility to have a look to actual present sheepfold that perhaps the Roman sheepfolds may have looked like these pictures, and you can see that the roof was covered by the Phragmites australis, and that the wall was very short, no more than 1 meter. But they can be really bigger, sometimes more than 80 to 100 meter, and you can put in this type of structure around 800 and 1,000 sheep, which is quite a lot. And of course, with times, these sheepfolds were destroyed. And when the roof is destroyed, the soil in earth is destroyed by time. And we can just find at the end the pebbles, the stone, which have been used for support the wall. And you can see here the wall which has fall, and we can find the clays which have been used for building the walls and some pebbles. So it's quite interesting to have an idea of how this former Roman sheepfold have disappeared. And so with the help of our archaeological colleague, sometimes it was easy to find this sheepfold, as in this situation near the Camargue area. And so we've got some water, some more shrubs, but sometimes it was very difficult. And with the Alps of our colleague archaeologists specialized in the Roman time, really it was not possible to find this structure. And so our idea was to date all this sheepfold, this Roman sheepfold, but it was possible with the help of the archaeologists. And after this datation, after that this datation has been done, we can collect. And the idea was, because we want to find very old charcoal, we will collect under the Roman sheepfold, and we've got this authorization to do that, to create some pits close to the foundation, to remove the foundation, to collect all the soil under the foundation, like in this situation. And sometimes the foundation was quite strong, but of course, at the end, we reconstruct really the foundation close to the former foundation. So we take care to put a truss of our action in this case. We have realized more than 15 pits, and we never found any trace from the Roman shepherds. So we really take care to let the site as clean as it was possible. And after that, the soil sample was we do charcoal extraction by sieving under water, which is a classical way to collect the charcoal. And we do extraction and identification. Perhaps some of you can recognize this guy. And we do, of course, charcoal identification. It was possible to realize 23 dates with 14 carbons, and to date some charcoal which have been clearly identified. And the first result is that we found some wood charcoal, around 600 wood charcoal, so what's good news. And our hypothesis, good hypothesis, we found more charcoal under foundation, around the 500, and only 100, around 100 in steppe soil. So that means that there was certainly the presence of trees or shrubs in the Crau area and the possibility to date the different fires. So this is just the repartition of the different charcoal. We have, of course, more charcoal under the Roman foundation, less in steppe soil, and a strong heterogeneity, but it's classical in soil wood charcoal research to have this heterogeneity from the different pits which have been done. So the result is we have a look to the temporal distribution of the 23 dated charcoal. We see that we've got 3 periods of intense, if I can see, intense fire, which all are linked with the presence of human and strong pastoral activities. Which is the case for the late Neolithic and the Bronze Age, but also from Roman periods and the Middle Age and modern period at the end. Concerning the taxonomical analysis, one of the first results is that the dates are close to human activities, pastoral activities, because certainly the Romans and during the Middle Age and the modern period, they use the wood for the construction. It's certainly the case for Quercus, sorry for the name, Quercus ilex, for example, or for Quercus pubescens, and also for Pinus spinaea or Pinus alopendis. And as you can see, there is less trees in the steppe area. Most of oldest dates we found in this area were not for trees, but for shrubs, such as Filaria angustifolia, a lot of Rosacea, certainly Rosa canina, or a kind of Rosa canina, or Thymus. And at the end, we find no late successional species, no species of mature forest in the steppe area. We found only some Quercus species, so Quercus ilex or Quercus pubescens, linked with the use of former sheepfolds. So this local data were not, in our opinion, sufficient to have a clear story of the origin. And we take the opportunity that the same kinds of studies were done in Europe, and especially in Germany, in communes, which is in South Bavaria, and also in the Chaume of the Vosges Mountains in the east of France. My personal contribution during my thesis in the hillside of Seine Valley in Upper Normandy, and we found also some data in the Mont Aigual and the Causse Méjean in the center of France. And the characteristic of all these studies, which have been already published when we decided to do these jobs, is that they have been published with the same type of investigation and objective. The objective was always to date the origin of grassland, whatever there was. It can be dry grassland, acidic grassland, and most of them were in plain or in the mountains areas. And for the result, when we have done all the taxonomical analysis, is that we've got some difference between the north of Europe and the south. In the south, especially during the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, for the Crau area, the Mont Lozère and the Grand Causse, which are all in the south of France, it seemed that most of the species which have been burned were early species of a successional series. It was pioneer species and not late successional species, at the opposite of the northern site in Europe. And concerning the chronological data, if I remember here, we've got this strong organization of the different fire events in the Crau area. We do not find the same repetition, and it was difficult to find the general trends of chronological data concerning the fire regimes. So to conclude about the origin, it seems that most of the dry grassland in Western Europe appear to be under drivers at local scale, resulting from first anthropogenic woodland clearing during the late Neolithic or Bronze Age. And the most big difference between the north of Europe and the south of Europe, it seems that in the temperate area, fire have been done in mature forest, really mature forest dominated by some quercus or sometimes some Fagus sylvatica. And in the south, it seems that the plant primary succession, it was our first hypothesis, has been stopped by the Neolithic forest clearance by anthropogenic fire of sheep grazing. So it was important to put our local result in this overview at the scale of Europe. So this is the end of our first question. The second question we try to answer, it's this famous question about the human legacy of former practice. Well, it's clear that we've got only in this area, we have already done a lot of investigation concerning the impact of industrial cultivation, industrial orchards, and so on. But here, our idea was in this reference ecosystem, it's this typical steppe area. Do we have some legacy of very old practice? You remember that we got this possibility to use this archaeological structure, which are the former Roman sheepfolds. Here you got now reconstitution and with the enclosure just near the sheepfolds. And so our idea was to collect and to sample the soil and the vegetation, also the seed bank in this area, to measure if there is a long-term impact on just the concentration of the sheep or the flock during the Roman time. And for that, again, we use this wonderful opportunity to study and to identify this former sheepfold. So we got a lot of choice. And of course, it was not sufficient for us just to compare the impact of the former exclosure during the Roman time and the the actual situation without the impact of this exclosure, because we've got only 2 data for our comparison. Our idea was to have a gradient from that period to our present period. And for that, we've got the chance, because in this steppe area, there is still around 50 sheepfold. We are still in activities. They have been built during the 19th century. And you can see, okay, the construction is different from the Roman time, but it always has this type of paddock of enclosure near the sheepfold. So the organization look like even now the organization from the Roman period. It's really close. And of course, some of these sheepfolds still in activities. Some of the other sheepfolds have been abandoned. Around this sheepfold during the present utilization, you've got the concentration of the flock around the sheepfold, which have determined the presence of belt of hyper-nitrophilous vegetation, as you can see here, with a lot of species strongly linked with the presence of nitrogen of the soil. And it was the trace from a concentration of the flock that we will use to make our sample, our sum sample and vegetation sample. And some of these sheepfolds are still used now, but some of them have been abandoned in the 20th century, which is not, it's an early abandonment. And you can see that the first stage of abandonment is the destruction of the roof. And some of them have been abandoned in the 19th century, and so we lose the roof and the part of the walls. Some of them have been abandoned in the 18th century, so you can see that more and more we will find only the foundation, as it is the case for the Roman sheepfold. So we've got this very nice gradient of abandonment that will allow us to travel in times by using the space, which is classical in community ecology. And for that, again, to identify this sheepfold and the hyper-nitrophilous vegetation belt, sometimes we've got, for the recent sheepfold, we've got this nice vegetation maps. So it's easy to find the sheepfold and the hypernitrophilous vegetation belts. It was also possible to find in the documents the location of the sheepfold which have been abandoned or still used in the 19th century. But of course, for the 18th century and more that for early events, for the 16th century, it was not possible to have a clear location. There was no GPS for the different sheepfolds. And again, we've got this close collaboration with our archaeologists colleagues, which really help us to find the different structures and help us to date this structure. So after this identification was done, we sample. We give no detail about this sample, but it is possible if you've got some question about that. We do soil chemical analysis, and we analyze the present vegetation in the quadrats. So always in the site where the paddock was present, it was always easy to find it. And for the result, of course, we've got some strong correlation between the fertility of the soil and the age of abandonment. For example, the active sheepfold and the sheepfold which have been recently abandoned, we've got a higher amount of total carbon, total nitrogen, available phosphorus, potassium, and so on. And concerning the Roman sheepfold, only the CN ratio increased, and it was not clearly easy to distinguish the Roman former Roman sheepfold from the steppe area, the controlled steppe. But when we do univariate analysis, so of course by time we've got a strong decrease for all the parameters which have been measured, except for the CN ratio. But you can see that it was an incredible discovering. But for total carbon and for available phosphorus, there is some difference between the Roman sheepfold area and the controlled steppe. So it means that even after 150 years of abandonment, we still have in the soil some trace that we can measure of change due to the concentration for several years, perhaps over dozens of years, of the flock of sheep, which is pretty incredible because, of course, during these 150 years of abandonment, after the abandonment of the Roman sheepfold, grazing and fires continue. So the cyanide is still present, even with the continuity of grazing and the continuity of the fire regime, which was not expected at the beginning. And concerning the vegetation, we've got also the present vegetation at the soil surface. We've got this type of correlation too. The active and recently abandoned sheepfolds are correlated with hypernitrophilous vegetations of Chenopodium murale, Chenopodium album, Dipotaxis tenifolium, etc. And for the Roman sheepfold of the stress-tolerant steppe species, again, it was not easy to do the difference. It is most of the vegetation, it's a typical stress-tolerant species of the steppe areas, and so vegetation are really different. Concerning the richness, we've got this incredible signal, like for the soil, that even after 150 years of abandonment, there are still a significant signal and the species richness. Here we've got a very nice curve of the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. We've got still more species in the former paddocks near the sheepfold abandoned by the Romans than in the controlled steppe, which is not really expected to. And of course, the dissimilarity increase with from the recently abandoned sheepfold when we go to the steppe control. So to conclude to the second question, it was really incredible for us that Roman sheepfolds and the former paddocks, just an area when they concentrate the sheep for several years, but there was still this signal that's still present so long times after the abandonment. It's a clear signal for restorationists and conservationists because, and I will don't make details about that because it's more restoration ecology than historical ecology. It will said to us now in this area, more area in the world, that our present impacts could be industrial agriculture, but building, factories, they will have an indelible impacts for the future millennia. And it can explain at the end that when we try to restore this type of area, when we try to restore the integrality of the pre-existing historical ecosystem, such as here the pre-existing steppe, that we cannot have success, and even in the short or in the middle terms, because the ecosystem will be so strongly degraded or changed that it will be impossible to reconstruct. And perhaps especially in the present time, when we've got a lot of change, climate change and land use change. So it will be the question of third investigation. Our idea was when we compare, as you can see here on our postcard, which have been taken around the beginning of the 20th century, or now, if you put these pictures in black and white, it's not easy to detect some change. Of course, we've got no colonization by trees, and it's not easy to identify there is some climate impact of change of pastoral practice. And for that, we need to do more precise inventories and have access to former botanical inventories. And so we've got this possibility. So we decided to, and only in this typical steppe vegetation, we decide to revisit again the former or old phytophysiological inventories, in relevés. And we've got chance because we found in this area for all the first part of the 20th century, around 2,050 relevés of phytophysiological inventory, which have been done in this area by this author. So thank you very much to this author for having done these jobs. And we realized new inventories for comparison in 2015 and 2016. So we do more than 100 new phytophysiological inventories or relevés. Thanks again for all the people who help us. And so, of course, the problem of doing new relevés or new phytophysiological inventories is that in the beginning of the 20th century, there was no GPS. So it was not possible to have a precise location, but we use only the data from the literature, from the bibliography, and it was possible to have an idea where this phytophysiological relevés were done, and to avoid to work on the unsuitable relevés which have been done in other type of vegetation. We do some classification, and we just keep really the relevés, the phytophysiological inventory, which have been carried down in the steppe area sensu stricto, in this vegetation, this typical steppe vegetation that we call locally here the kusu, and we avoid all the other type of inventories. And so it was when possible to do this phytophysiological relevés, the new one, near the former the old inventories, and so this is the map. It was possible to collect. So we've got a kind of spatial localization, but of course it's not enough. It's not enough to have a very precise location at the scale of the meter of 10 meters or so on. And so I would like to attract your attention to all the methodological limits of this kind of jobs, because we have no precise location available from the old inventories. And sometimes when our past colleague, our past phytophysiologists do the job, it was not for the same objective as we do now. In general, they try just to characterize the vegetation in a kind of regional approach of the vegetation, so they only realize several relevés of botanical inventories, and sometimes you've got an observable effect. They are more attracted by the beautiful species such as Phlomis lignitis or Rhizopus officinalis, and they integrate them in their relevés. And for the most recent inventories, as in in general, we do the jobs in quadrats or in very small area. We are able to contact even the smallest species, which is not really easy to recognize or to identify if you are if you realize your inventories in several hundreds of meters, for example. So we have to take care about all this comparison, and of course about sometimes the problem of synonymy that we cannot solve easily. And nevertheless, to reduce really all these limits, we also decided to use what we already know about the vegetation, even if you don't have a precise location of the former inventories. We know that there is a strong, as you remember, a strong impact of the presence of sheepfolds with a belt of nitrosilus vegetation. So we decided to do our recent inventories in area without the influence of sheepfolds. And in general, these areas are characterized by the dominance of an herbaceous species, Brachypodium retusum. And so we decide to do our inventories in an area when we've got the same abundance dominance coefficients to be sure that, okay, it's not the precise location at the square meter, but it's the vegetation look like that. And so some result, an interesting result that there was no significant difference between old and recent inventories, which is quite good because it can say that we work like our past colleague, but we've got no difference in species richness, but fortunately we've got difference in species composition as 9 taxa appear and 32 taxa disappeared. And if we do the correlation between the species and the recent inventories or the old inventories, we can see that the old inventories got the most higher cover or higher frequency of this famous chamephyte species, such as Thymus vulgaris, which is really the one of the typical species of this area. Remember, it was mentioned by Pliny in 77 after Christ, which is really one dominant species of the area, and other perennial species such as Euphorbia segerena, Phlomis lignitis, or Teucrion polium. They characterize the old data, the old inventories, and for the recent inventories, we've got more frequency or cover of more that we can call more ruderal species, but it's not strictly ruderal species because we are still in a neogotrophic steppe. But we find more Avena barbata, we find more Carlina lanata, Geranium mole, and Verbascum sinuatum. So sometimes, except for this species, perhaps it's an observer effect, but not for this one, which is quite beautiful and sure that they certainly mention it if they can saw this species in former times. And so now we see some change in the species composition. So it's quite very important. That's because it means that by time, even if we continue the traditional grazing system, we have change, and that again we cannot restore or conserve the typical vegetation which have been described in the beginning of the 20th century. But now more important is the origin of this change. It could be, of course, climate change, or because all around the Crau area we've got this big harbor with a lot of industry and a lot of emission of nitrogen in the air, so we can have some nitrogen deposit. But we also know, as you remember, that we've got change in pastoral practice because of the arrival of wolf, with more and more enclosure, more and more paddocks, and sometimes more and more concentration of sheep. And so we decide to answer to this question: is it the impact of climate change, or is it the impact of pastoral change by integrate our travel in times on space? And for that, we do that type of job in this paper. We use the data we got on the spatial scale, because we know that the vegetation from the sheepfold is organized in belt in function of the trophic level in nitrogen of the soil, and we have already identified this ruderal gradients of the vegetation, and so we decided to put our historical data in this matrix of several hundreds of larvae and several hundreds of plants. And you can see that our former old inventories are not included in this spatial gradient, this nitrophilus spatial gradients, but the present inventories are really included in this gradient. So it means clearly that our change are not climatic change. It's not only nitrogen deposition, but because of the integration of our recent data in this gradient, it is due to pastoral change. And we can also analyze this fact by the identification of the different species. These species which characterize the present data are not only nitrophilus species, but also ruderal species. Most of them are species from Cardus genus, for example. So it was very interesting to find this solution to travel in space, to mimic, as you know here, to use the toposequence for travel along the chronosequence. So just to conclude and I hope to open the debates for our case, but it's not only the case of the Crau area, the historical traits of a trajectory we can identify for the ecosystem is part of the definition of the fact that the ecosystem is unique, and in fact each cultural ecosystem is unique, and also its plant community, and so it will be always difficult to find some way for generalize some result in restoration or conservation over the type of ecosystem. And really it's important because it's not always clear for classical ecological study that these historical traits are really part of the definition of the uniqueness of our cultural ecosystem. And it's clear for us from our for the persistence of this Roman footprints that it will be difficult to erase our present footprint, and it's clear that the human footprint will be indelible in the future millennia, and that it will be really, really difficult and perhaps impossible to restore the integrality of former historical or cultural ecosystem. And for that, all projects of restoration that want to restore this integrality of all the historical ecosystem, like a fixed scenery in a whole postcard, will be not possible. And it's clear nonsense in the context of evolutionary biology, because it can change, and now global change, especially, it can be, of course, pastoral change in the reference ecosystem, or, of course, climate change. Nevertheless, it means that our study means that we will still need historical ecology studies, because even if we choose to have passive restoration or just reviving this new ecosystem, if we want to understand clearly the potential evolution of this new ecosystem, of the impact of rewilding action, of or passive restoration, to do nothing, we need to integrate the effect of the persistence of former human land use. So very good news for our historical ecologists is that whatever the objective will be used, if restorationists want to restore a cultural ecosystem, or if they want to do passive restoration of rewilding, they will always need research in historical ecology, whatever the objectives are. So restorationists and conservationists will still need a lot of data and research in historical ecology, which is quite a good news. And so I will finish my presentation in this sentence. So many thanks, I hope, for your virtual attention.